On a cold, lonesome night, I was doing late night deliveries until I entered this hotel that looked completely abandoned. The inside felt decrepit and hollow. People were definitely living there, but I couldn't help but feel this weird feeling of isolation and also this sense of comfort. I know I'm not alone with this feeling either, as tons of people all over the internet have come together these recent years to express this sensation to a point where it's almost become universal. What exactly is this feeling? Where does it come from, and why is the internet so obsessed with liminal spaces? And also, before you say anything, yes, I know I've done a video very similar to this last year, but shh. Liminal spaces, defined as portraying empty or abandoned places that appear eerie, forlorn, and often surreal. Common places of transition pertaining to the concept of liminality. Now, the liminal space trend didn't really become as worldwide until the backrooms became a thing, but it's always been a phenomenon as folklorist Arnold van Gennep came up with the concept in the early 20th century. Many of these areas that would be considered to be liminal include long hallways or familiar rooms that resemble something that was once there, aka nostalgia. The internet tends to make older things like this into an aesthetic, but I've always been intrigued in how the internet took something as broad as something like this and turned it into such a cultural movement. I mean, the backroom's really proving this in general. Now, what exactly makes these images stick out, and why is it so mesmerizing to others? Well, it all goes back to the internet's obsession with the uncanny valley. You see, images like these have this sense of surrealism that instantly grabs your attention. Any image that has a resemblance to the uncanny would do this, and an image that seems somewhat familiar would maybe even hypnotize you a bit further. The creepy aspect of something like this can come from the fact that even though it looks familiar, it feels off in many ways, like how there's supposed to be something else here, but instead there's nothing, which gives that uncanny feeling that the internet absolutely loves. Watch this video to find out why. Now that we have the context that illustrates what makes liminal spaces pop out, why do people obsess over it? What makes people gravitate towards these images? I have one word for you: vibes. People like nostalgia, and liminal spaces resemble something once lost. These two elements equals vibes. That added with the internet as a concept, old camera filters, and maybe even ambient music. You just got the best vibe of all time. There's just something about liminal spaces that reminds people of their childhoods in both a sentimental and existential way, which is why it has the ability to be creepy while also feeling consoling in a way. And wait, you may be asking, what has the internet got to do with any of this? Well, the internet has existed for decades and is still particularly new and ever changing as we speak. This change can be seen as scary. And there's something about the old internet that brings out that weird sense of nostalgia that now can come off as creepy because it doesn't feel right anymore. Either way, you can make a parallel with how we obsess over liminal spaces because of how it resembles the isolation of the old internet, or, like previously mentioned before, our childhoods, except with it being more bare to resemble the lost innocence. Some of the cool things people have been able to do with this aesthetic is the aforementioned backrooms, which has as much lore as the SCP does at this point. There's also so many different locations within this creepypasta that all resemble the idea of something that once was, like a kid's play area that is completely empty, or an office that has transformed into this long labyrinth of endless hallways with that familiar walls and carpeting and all that whatnot. There's also water parks and other areas that can give people nostalgia and a fondness over these images because of how they were once at a place like this. But there's always that sinking, unnerving feeling because of how the images used usually portray a desolate version of that setting. The backrooms constantly feeds off of this notion and off of the constant fear of paranoia mixed with the endless loneliness. There's also analog horror, which uses elements of liminal spaces to create an uncomfortable atmosphere for the viewer. A great example of this is Skinamarink, which uses the notion a ton throughout the movie, with my favorite being this setup of cartoons on the TV in the middle of this kid's room, which is used in this movie in order to bring that weird sense of comfort to the viewer before it's used against them.
Nostalgia being used against the viewer in order to scare them has been such an important part of internet horror. The most mainstream usage of liminal spaces can be seen in The Shining with how the setting is utilized throughout the movie. The utter emptiness of the hotel and the long shots of these hallways just oozes with what I've been talking about. And anytime it's filled with something, it's usually some sort of terrifying imagery. The LSD Dream Emulator is another example because of how it constantly has that impending paranoia that liminal spaces brings you as you explore these trippy areas that parallel those liminal spaces. It's used in more of an abstract artistic way rather than as a scare tactic. Five Nights at Freddy's is another great example of this because of how it utilizes these liminal spaces as a way to flesh out the nostalgia factor of the animatronics, which also makes the overall setting that much more terrifying when shit eventually goes down. Also, shout out to the whole element of lost innocence that I just brought up before. Yeah, the franchise itself just also like constantly has this motif with the themes and the setting that I just mentioned. Every game also uses the similar idea of liminal spaces, with the most recent game using a large empty mall as its setting. Myhouse.wad is another example that was very, very recent. It's a Doom mod that utilizes liminal spaces to trick the players into a false sense of security before ripping it away in subtle ways, including messing with people's perspectives. The mod slowly becomes more and more unhinged in ways that become more noticeable. I won't say too much more about it because other people have made great videos about it in general, but the heavy influence liminal spaces has had on this Doom mod is shown in ways that give appreciation to it. Overall, liminal spaces often create this weird mixture of comfort and creepiness that the internet is in love with, mainly because it gives them that nostalgic feeling while leaving room for it to be used in horror contexts. Liminal spaces aren't a new concept, but it's being constantly expanded now as the world and the internet continues to change and as people continue to remember the past. Liminal spaces themselves could represent that nostalgia, while the emptiness of these images can represent the fact that we can never go back to those times that we fondly remember. Something that is just forever gone. Hopefully y'all enjoyed this little video I made for Friday the 13th. I don't really have any Halloween special in mind this month, which is why I made this video. The reason why I don't really have a Halloween special in mind is because the Five Nights at Freddy's movie is coming out and all my attention is on that right now. But keep in mind, anything can happen. You never know. Wink, wink.